Welcome, and thank you, everyone, for joining us today for SafetyChain Software's Leadership Series, and today's topic, Insights on the Rapidly Changing Landscape of Food Safety and Quality Assurance, with our special guest speaker, Dr. David Acheson. My name is Barbara Levin. I'm SafetyChain's Senior VP of Marketing, and I'll be your host for today's event. Our session should last approximately 60 minutes, including Q&A. We're going to start with a presentation by David Acheson on the rapidly changing FSQA landscape. He's going to cover 2012 impact, FSMA, the political climate, return on investment, as well as other topics. I'll follow Dr. Acheson with just a very high-level look at the solutions provided by SafetyChain, your sponsors for today, and then we'll take all of your questions. Before we introduce Dr. Acheson, let me give you just a few housekeeping items. We're being hosted for today's event by WebEx. Should you require any technical support during the event, you can call WebEx support directly at 1-866-229-3239 and press option 1. Again, 866-229-3239. Press option 1. If you're having difficulties or technical issues, but you're still in the webinar, you can also go to the chat button on your toolbar that drops down from the top of your screen and send a chat directly to the WebEx producer. We will be taking your questions at the end of the presentation. If you would like to enter your question before the presentations are over, you can go to the drop-down toolbar, go to the arrow on the right-hand side, and click on that, and you can click then on the question tab where you'll be able to enter and send your question, and we'll have those queued up. When we get to the About Your Sponsor section of the presentations, we'll be going out of full screen at that time so that you will be able to start to put your questions in then as well. Please do not put questions for Dr. Acheson or myself in the chat because we do not look at the chat boxes while we are presenting. And last, the slides and the recording of today's event will be made available to everyone who's registered. You'll receive an email within 24 hours where you'll be able to download those. So we know that we usually get a lot of questions on that. I wanted to give you that information up front. I'm very excited now to introduce today's guest speaker, Dr. David Acheson. Dr. Acheson is a partner with Levitt Partners, and he runs their food safety and import practice. And he's a former associate commissioner for foods at the FDA. He's the former chief medical officer from the FDA. He was an associate professor at Tufts Medical School, a practitioner in internal medicine and infectious diseases in the UK, and a graduate of the University of London Medical School. And with that, welcome very much, Dr. Acheson. We're pleased to have you here today.
Barbara, great pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me to do that. And pleasure to be on the call. And what I plan to do in the next 35 to 40 minutes is provide you all with some of my insights on the rapidly changing landscape of food safety and quality assurance. I want to begin by just focusing on some of the current key issues. I've entitled this slide, The Pain Continues, and it certainly does. We have seen a rash of recalls in the last month or so. We had the most devastating listeria outbreak last year, and as you can see there, most deadly outbreak since 1924. Currently, we're dealing with listeria in cheese. The Canadians are struggling with a massive beef recall from XL Foods, and as it says, too, the nightmare continues with an expanding recall. Domestically here in the United States, we're having problems with peanuts again, peanut butter, and a variety of other products, which is illustrative of problems that have occurred in the past come back. We have got expansion of a variety of peanut product recalls as the information is flowing down the supply chain. So even though often on people's radar screens right now, today, is what's going to happen to the Food Safety Modernization Act? When's it going to come out? When are we going to see rules? And I'll talk about that. Let's not lose sight of the fact that there are plenty of issues that are occurring right now that we need to pay attention to. And to that, I want to just begin to talk about the changing dynamics. In this space that we all work in of food safety, food quality, we're dealing with constant long-term challenges, and we've got some short-term challenges. And under the long-term challenges, it's things like the preventive controls. What are we doing within our own four walls? Looking at our GMPs. What are we doing around controlling our supply chain? I think the evidence is accumulating that our supply chain is often our biggest vulnerability. How do we track products? How do we know if we've received something that's problematic? How are we handling audits? Increasing use of systems, third-party audits, GFSI is gaining momentum. How do we manage that? Obviously, we want to continue to avoid lawsuits. That has become increasingly prevalent, increasingly problematic, and something that is unquestionably on everybody's radar screens. And despite all these long-term challenges, which only build, we've got to find cost-effective solutions. The cost of producing food isn't going down. There's increasing pressure to produce inexpensive food for consumers, and so we have got to look for cost-effective solutions looking at the ROI. Those things don't change. Those are long-term challenges, and they're not likely to change. We've got short-term challenges. We've got national politics going on right now, and we've got a Food Safety Modernization Act, and we'll talk about a variety of these things as we move forward. Looking at some of these longer-term challenges, there's a changing food safety landscape, global food supply, shifting science, as I've already mentioned, challenges with controlling our supply chain, the increasing impact of media, mainstream and social, and the constant consumer expectation that every food item that a consumer consumes is completely safe. Nothing wrong with that, but it creates challenges and difficulties. We've got new threats, and obviously we've got new regulations. If we dive down a little bit into some of these issues, this slide that's up now is illustrative of the trends that we're seeing in the food space. This is from FDA, a document that was published a little while ago, but it illustrates the very obvious trend of a 13% overall increase in FDA-regulated products. And while we have got every FDA-regulated product in here, the chunk at the top is food. The blue part is foods. We've also got drugs, devices, and other things. But the point of showing this is this increasing trend of imported ingredients and finished products that are under FDA regulatory control. There's no sign this trend is going to slow down. It's huge for seafood, especially aquaculture seafood, produce, fresh vegetables, and a whole series of other ingredients and finished products. We're becoming more reliant on this global food supply. Increases challenges, increasing risks, increases concerns. Shifting to the changing science. This is something that I have talked about before in other places, and it's becoming increasingly important to recognize, so why suddenly have we seen problems with peanut butter and spinach and other things and raw cookie dough? Have these foods suddenly started to become problematic where they weren't before? No, I don't think so. I think what we have done is we have become much, much better, more efficient at connecting illness with a food product. This is happening at the local and the state levels, greater capacity to link food with illness, greater capacity to take 2 or 3 people who've got sick, you ask them what they ate, where they ate it, and with that, the epidemiologists can begin to put together a story of what may be the most likely cause. That has developed huge power, it's heavily used, and it's been very effective. It doesn't work all the time, but it has been very effective in identifying food products. That trend is going to continue. And at the bottom of my slide here, I've got a few of the recent foods that had not previously been associated with problems that are just listed there. No great surprises for anybody who's in this space, but the list just keeps growing. We've also developed, into my third point on this slide, the capacity to measure lower and lower levels of chemicals. And while from a purely scientific perspective, that is intriguing as we push the level of detection down from parts per million to parts per trillion and beyond, what that does is the science gets ahead of us understanding the public health risk. And we're able to now measure extremely low levels of chemicals in foods. So if, from a consumer perspective, the message is a presence, absence, yeah, it's there, but it's there in vanishingly small amounts, what does that mean to me? Well, We don't really know. We don't know the public health impact of those very low levels over a lifetime of exposure. But it's very difficult to convey that message that a little bit of arsenic is probably harmless. It's complicated messaging, and the technology tends to get ahead of us. The improvements in genetic testing and whole genome sequencing is allowing now the regulators to sequence the whole genomes of Salmonella and E. coli very, very quickly and connect these dots even more efficiently. We're going to see a whole lot more of this. We've got new threats. Our population, not just in North America, but globally, is generally getting older. We've got a more immune compromise, not just because of the elderly, but because of modern medical technology, transplants, drugs, chemotherapy. Essentially what we're doing here is increasing our pool of individuals, consumers, who are more susceptible to pathogens like Salmonella, E. coli, Listeria. So the bar keeps changing. We got concerns with antibiotic resistance, Salmonella, Campylobacter. This is probably not going to change anytime soon, irrespective of what changes are made on farms or with human prescribing, both of which likely contribute to this problem in some way or another. That trend is going to continue. And the regulatory capacity on these things is going to change. We've got new strains. I popped up here E. coli 0104, which was the E. coli strain that caused that massive outbreak in Europe just recently, in which there were over 4,000 people sick in Europe, mostly in Germany. 800 of them got this awful condition known as hemolytic uremic syndrome, and there were numerous deaths. So we're constantly having to deal with new strains. Threats just continue to change. I've already mentioned briefly consumers and the media. This is another series of challenges. This is not going to change. This is going to continue. And it's going to become more and more and more important for the food sector to recognize that working with the media is actually to everybody's benefit. Educating the media and working with them in that general direction is going to help us all. What are the consequences for the private sector, for industry? Obviously, damage to brands, driving a greater focus on prevention. Gone are the days when we can afford to say, we will solve the problem when it happens. We have never had a recall. We're not likely to have a recall. We'll just deal with it when it comes up. Not so much today. You don't get a second chance sometimes. When you have that recall, you may be looking at Chapter 11 or worse, or criminal investigations. And it's essentially you have one bite at this, and you cannot afford to mess it up. So there's this shift of recognition of these challenges from the individuals managing this at the VP level or the manager level up to the C-suite, the CEOs, the CFOs, the boards are now saying, wow, we've got to pay attention to this. Hence the greater focus on prevention. We've got additional regulatory oversight. We've got the Food Safety Modernization Act. And as I mentioned initially, we have to look for cost-effective solutions. So let me turn now a little bit to the Food Safety Modernization Act and speculate, and I want to emphasize to everybody that this is just Acheson speculation. I don't have a crystal ball that works anymore. I thought I did, but it's got increasingly opaque. So let me just speculate in terms of FSMA, because this is a common question. Well, what will happen if President Obama wins, if Governor Romney wins, and what's Congress going to do? Well, here's a speculation. I think if President Obama wins, obviously the Food Safety Modernization Act will roll out. I believe it highly probable that much of it is ready to go, and that we are just on a temporary hold, as we nearly always are in Washington when there's an election coming up. Essentially, the whole town goes on freeze with regard to regulations or proposed rules, and we just sit and wait. So I would speculate that if President Obama wins, we will see FSMA proposed rules come out fairly quickly, December, January time frame, and we will move forward from there. The rules will emerge, there will be comments, and then we will get a final rule sometime in 2013. If Governor Romney wins, I also believe that those rules will emerge, and will emerge quickly. Why? Because I believe that President Obama will want to get these proposed rules out. He will want to make a stake in the sand and say, here's what we think they should look like, and then look for a potential future President Romney to change them. So I think we will still see them come out as proposed rules. There will likely be changes to them as they evolve through 2013, obviously, if whoever's sitting in the White House changes. We can anticipate that. But I still believe that even if they change a little bit, they will emerge in 2013, whoever is occupying the White House. And why do I say that? Think back to what drove FSMA in the first place. It was almost a historical event that consumer organizations, regulators, and the private sector all wanted increased regulation in the food space. That hasn't changed. That pressure will continue. So there is still the desire, essentially, to get some lines in the sand as exactly what is expected for food production and prevention, both in manufacturing, processing, around imports, and on farms. So either way, I think this election will change probably ultimately what they look like, but perhaps not the timeline an awful lot. Congress, at this point, really isn't playing a significant role in terms of the proposed rules. They've done their work. They passed the law, which the president signed. The only issue where Congress plays in is that they pretty much hold the purse strings. And FSMA was an unfunded mandate. It still is an unfunded mandate. And I certainly don't see new resources coming into that anytime soon through Congress. So they're all playing a part, but I think a key message to everybody on this webinar is start preparing if you haven't already, because these things are going to happen irrespective of who's sitting in the White House. So now let's talk a little bit about this act, Food Safety Modernization Act, and I'll give you some perspectives on where I think we need to focus. There's four main components. Prevention, heavily focused on prevention. Targeted for increased inspections and enhanced response. That's a bit of a problem simply because increased inspections require more inspectors, more resources, and I've just mentioned the resources are a bit thin. That's driving enhanced partnerships. What does that mean? That means we will see more and more involvement of states domestically, more involvement of foreign governments, and more involvement of third-party auditors, all of which is built into the structure of the Food Safety Modernization Act. Heavy focus on import safety. Very distinct changes that have occurred, shifting the burden onto importers with regard to the safety of imported food and products under FDA control. So the risks continue to go on. We continue to have compliance risk. We have supply chain risk. We've got legal liability. And all of those create brand risk. So how do we begin to protect the brand? And I believe that one of the most key elements to protecting the brand is to focus on two of the three aspects that are on this current slide. Food quality and food safety, I believe, are the two most important things for every food company to focus on. Wherever you are on the supply chain, whether you're at the farm end, transport, manufacturing, processing, a wholesaler, a retailer, or a restaurant, it doesn't matter. Pay attention to quality and safety. If you do that, and if you do that using current thinking, current risk-based strategies, current technologies, I believe you will be 99.9% the way there to be compliant. So the message here is don't let compliance drive your behavior. Let safety and quality drive your behavior. Another way of looking at that, another reason for doing that, is that if you're out of compliance, it can cause you some heartburn and a headache and a 483 from FDA, which is never pleasant. But if your safety and quality let you down, your brand essentially can go under. You're unlikely to go under with a 483 or a warning letter. So that's really my philosophy here, is focus on the safety and the quality. But do that through the lens of the Food Safety Modernization Act, because there's a lot of things in that to me make sense inherently about risk-based preventive controls, supply chains, recall systems, the prerequisite programs, allergens, environmental controls, all of these things which are key to running a first-rate operation around safety and quality. And then, as I said, the compliance will just trot along happily behind and there won't be a problem. So what are the perspectives on FSMA? Well, two. First, pay attention to what's already passed. The law passed in January 2011. It contained a lot of stuff, and some of the things are already out there. Some of these things in FSMA that passed in 2011 are already on the books, and the FDA already has the authority to do a few things. They can inspect the records. I'm going to say more about that in just a second. They have mandatory recall authority. That basically means that the FDA can now make you do a recall. New authority, personally, my view of that is I think it's extremely unlikely to be used, simply because it's a whole lot faster, a whole lot easier, and a whole lot less expensive to go with a voluntary recall than a mandatory recall. There's an authority to require import certificates under certain situations. There's an authority to suspend registration. I'll say a little bit more about that also in just a second, because I believe that's an important one, as is expanded administrative detention. So those things are things that are here today. They're on the books now. FDA has the authority to do these things right now, and then obviously prepare for what's coming. So let's take a little bit of a deeper dive, perspectives on this. As I mentioned, the agency has greater access to records. So what does this mean? This means that in the past, FDA used to have a very robust reason for looking at distribution and manufacturing records. They used to have solid evidence that a product was adulterated. And it used to have to be really pretty solid. Today, all the agency needs is a reasonable probability, which is why I boldened it on this slide, which is a much, much lower bar. Reasonable probability is not that higher mark to reach. And what I think is reasonable and what you think is reasonable may not be the same thing. If I'm the regulator and I'm not being very reasonable, in your view, hey, I'm the regulator and I think it's reasonable. I want to see the records. It gets to be a little bit gray and fluffy. So what does that mean? It means that the agency will certainly have more access, more availability to look at your records. Now, there's got to be a reasonable probability that the food will cause a serious adverse health consequence, the second part of that second bullet. What does that mean? A serious adverse health consequence is a Class 1 type situation, salmonella, listeria, allergens, that type of thing. So it's still limited to some extent to a reasonable probability that the food will cause a serious adverse health problem. What can the regulators look at? Pretty much anything. Anything relating to manufacturing, processing, and so on, holding, imports. They can look at your consumer complaint log. They can look at testing programs, which then raises the question of, well, if the regulators can look at my testing, then maybe I shouldn't be doing testing. Well, if that's the conclusion you've come to, I would urge you to rethink it, because it's not the right conclusion. It's much more important and appropriate to do the right kind of testing with the right kind of sampling and act appropriately. The FDA will think much more highly of you if you run into a problem. If you have a robust testing program that typically catches things and you correct them, than simply saying, well, we don't test. And that way, if we don't test, we don't have to show the records. Not a good idea. The agency is not allowed to look at things like personnel records and financial records. That is a very different set of authorities, which they do not have. Finally, this record access can expand to other parts of your business. So if you are manufacturing a variety of products, possibly in different facilities, and the FDA come into one of them because they have a reasonable probability related to a particular item that you manufacture, and they look and they don't like what they see, they now have the authority to say, we want to see the manufacturing and processing records, etc., for the other things you make in this facility. And oh, by the way, we want to see the same details from your other facilities. So it's a little bit of, you can pull on a thread here and it continues to unravel. So this inspection of records thing is really quite significant. And it's important that everybody be aware that this is an authority that the FDA has, and it's quite a big change. Second one that is currently live and could happen, although I don't believe FDA has done this so far, is to suspend your registration. While I'm on registration, let me just briefly mention a couple of things on registration. The requirement to register as a food company was enacted in the Bioterrorism Act of 2002 and became active in 2005. So if you're a manufacturer, processor, wholesaler, distributor of food, you need to register with FDA wherever you are on the planet if your food is going into interstate commerce within the United States. That is the requirement to register. FSMA didn't change that. FSMA didn't change who has to register. What it changed was if you have to register, you will have to re-register every 2 years. The re-registration process was supposed to kick in on October 1st and run for 3 months. As I'm sure many of you are aware, it was delayed. And I don't know for certain when it will come out. I anticipate it won't be very long delayed, and I also anticipate that once it does emerge, that the FDA will push out the time to give people a full 3 months. So if it comes out at the end of October, it'll run through November, December, and January. I think that's highly likely. So remember, if you are already registered, you will have to re-register. There's going to be lots of information moving around about that. If you think you should be registered and you are not, then you should absolutely do it. Don't wait. That's also very clear. So we've got the need to register. Again, that hasn't changed. Some of the data you're going to have to provide has changed, and we'll see that when the re-registration comes out. Some of the information about what you make has changed, but the FDA will provide guidance on exactly what that means. What has changed that's important is that now FDA can suspend that registration. It's a little bit like the police pulling your driver's license, or you're having your driver's license suspended by a judge. It basically puts you out of business in the short term. You will not be able to import food. You will not be able, if you're outside the U.S., to export it into the U.S. You won't be able to offer food into interstate commerce. It's a little analogous for anybody in the USDA world of the USDA FSIS pulling the inspector. When they do that, it effectively shuts you down. You can make product, but you can't ship it. So suspension of registration is a very important one to watch. Finally, under this list of what's out there today, we've got administrative detention, in which the agency needs credible evidence. Used to need credible evidence that the food presents a serious adverse health consequence. So pretty high bar. Credible evidence of a Class 1 type problem. That was changed in FSMA to reasonable belief. We're back to that reasonable word again, that food's adulterated or misbranded. So much, much, much lower bar. It allows the FDA essentially to put their arms around food in a warehouse or a facility for a limited period of time, usually 30 days. But it's a low bar to do this, and the FDA has already exercised this several times. As we look to now FSMA future attractions, there are 4 rules that are very relevant and, as I'm sure everybody on this call is aware, have been sitting at the Office of Management and Budget since December last year, so almost a year, and there's 4 of them. There are 2 on preventive controls, 1 for human foods and 1 for animal foods. And as you note there, I have suggested that these should be effective in July 2012. The FDA made it very clear that these rules were not in effect for obvious reasons. They're not out yet, even as proposed rules. And that when they are out, then there will be a period for ramping up. So we've got preventive controls for human foods and animal foods. Under the import requirements, we've got foreign supply verification. And under the produce, we have a produce rule, which essentially, in simple terms, is going to take good agricultural practice guidance and make it a requirement. Now, foreign supply verification and the preventive controls are very closely linked, because in essence, the preventive controls are all about exactly what they say, preventive controls. Risk-based approaches, risk-based thinking. The foreign supply verification program is all about applying that to imported foods. So what's going on? Where's this stuff stuck? How does it all work? Well, very briefly, the rulemaking process, if you look at this slide, begins over on the left with Congress giving FDA the authority to make some changes. They change the law, and the President signs it. That was what happened at the end of 2010 and January 2011 when President Obama signed FSMA and created the law which gave the FDA the authority to draft new regulations. Second box in. The FDA drafts the new regulations. The agency does their best to get them right, submits them to their bosses in the Health and Human Services Department. We're now in the third box in. HHS approves the draft and passes it on to the Office of Management and Budget, who reviews it for several very important criteria. Principally, what OMB is doing is looking at, number 1, the economic impact of these laws on small, medium, and large business. So they are all about, is this cost effective? If it's going to cost the private sector X dollars to do this, do we get X dollars public health benefit from doing it? Or better yet, 2X. If the economics don't match, OMB don't like it because of their looking after the economic impact on business. Secondly, OMB is responsible for looking at potential trade issues from these rules. So they look very carefully. If we do this, require importers to do this, will that have an impact on trade? Will we get some issues with foreign countries upset about trade barriers, non-tariff trade barriers? And then thirdly, OMB is looking at, well, if FDA do something, is that going to have an impact on other parts of the federal government that need to be figured out ahead of time and not dealt with after the fact? So OMB actually plays a pretty important economic, trade, and coordination role across the government. And these rules have been sitting there in OMB while this process has been going on for quite some time. They've been there, as I say, since November, December last year. Once OMB lets them out, they release for public comment. But they're released as proposed rules. Remember, proposed rules. And as I said earlier, if the election changes the administration, I think we will see these proposed rules come out fairly quickly. And if the election does not change the administration, I think they will come out maybe not quite as quickly, but they will still be pretty swift. When they come out, I'm sure there's going to be lots of opportunity for discussion, information dissemination, but pay attention to what they do to you. And if they do something that you don't like, submit comment. Once comments are in, FDA goes back. As you see the the cycle repeats. FDA will draft new regulations, respond to the comments, and it circles through over and over until we get it right, or at least as close to right as we can manage. This process can take a while. Again, I believe that we will see rules in the early part of 2013 at the latest, and I would guess that these will become final, depending on who's in the White House, sometime during 2013, with about 12 months between finalization and expectation that large firms will have to comply. So we've got some time, but not a lot, because there's a lot to do. So as we look at these rules, and people say, well, I'm going to wait. No, don't wait. There's a lot in the law. I would say 85, 90% of what's going to be in these rules you can infer from the law. And like I said, if the administration changes, I don't think much of this is going to change, number one. And number two, this is good food safety and food quality sense to protect the brand, irrespective of the compliance part. So what should you be thinking about? Obviously, no-brainer, hazard analysis, prerequisite programs. The law, FSMA, will require you to build a food safety plan. You've got to write it all down, and most importantly, to the bottom of the slide, you've got to implement it. This slide is simply pulled from what's in the law. This is out of the Act. These are the things to think of in the hazard analysis, the standard biology, chemical, physical risks, plus a whole bunch of other things. They're on the slide. On the right-hand side, the prerequisite programs. This is part of robust risk-based thinking today for many, many food companies, but it's got to be put together into a comprehensive and current plan. And as you can see, there are things like product tracking and customer complaint systems and environmental monitoring and allergen controls. And it's not going to work for you simply to say, yeah, we don't think environmental monitoring is important. You need to have that in your plan, and if you don't think it's important, you should say why you don't think it's important. Up at the top, you've got to be thinking about intentional contamination. This is focused heavily on terrorism. Hasn't been much about terrorism since the Bioterrorism Act, 2002, but that has now swung back in on Food Safety Modernization Act, and you will be expected to think about terrorism and how to protect against that. And I think we will see more guidance and more rules coming out from FDA in relation to terrorism. So you build your food safety plan. Over on the left of my slide here, I've got what does the written plan look like, the facility information, the prerequisite programs, the HACCP, the preventive controls. But what really matters is what's going on the other side of the slide, the ongoing activities, the monitoring, the corrective actions, the verification. That is what the regulators will expect you to do. That's what's going to stop you having the problem. You can write the best plan in the world, and if it's sitting on the shelf, it's not going to do you any good. It's not going to make you compliant, and it's certainly not going to protect the brand by having robust safety and quality programs. So those monitoring, corrective actions, and verification is key. What's a little bit gray right now is what does the continual documentation look like? The FDA is going to expect that. So arguably, that's the one thing that is like, not quite sure what that one's going to look like, but you're certainly going to have to track it and keep records, likely for a minimum of 2 years. But be thinking, do I have my plan figured out? Do I have my programs figured out? And if am I monitoring the right things? Do I have good, robust corrective action systems? Am I capturing all of that? Documenting it. It's going to be really, really important. And like I said, it's important for producing safe products anyway. Turning now to importation just very briefly. This is a massive game changer, and I'm sure many of you have tracked with what's going on with importation, but let me just give you a little perspective here of what has changed. What's changed principally is a shift by FDA from focusing on the port of entry, catching the stuff that they think is problematic, shutting down through testing programs, inspections of risky product. FSMA shifted the burden to the importer of record. What does that mean? The importer of record, not clearly defined in FSMA, but my interpretation is that is the person who owns the product at the time at which it arrives in the United States. We may have to finesse that definition a little bit, but it's I think, going to be close. That importer of record, has responsibility to make sure that food is manufactured, transported, processed within the Food Safety Modernization Act. There's a little bit of an incentive program to get it right, and FDA is beginning to talk in more detail about what that will look like. So this foreign supply verification program, this is one of the rules that is currently sitting in OMB, so I think we can anticipate that we will see this one fairly soon. And that's going to be an important and a very important one to look at. It'll be linked in with these preventive control systems. And this slide's a little complicated, but simply what this means is that you will have to be compliant with the new rules and the old rules. 418, 419 are the new stuff, 402, 403 is the old stuff in very simple terms. You'll have to verify that the food imported into the U.S. is safe as food produced and sold domestically. The FDA has the authority to require lot-by-lot certificates, annual on-site inspections, periodic sampling and testing. So they have the authority to do a lot of new things to these products. We don't have a good handle on the rules yet, but I think the message here is clear. If you are reliant on imported food, either as an ingredient or a product that you're selling, then pay attention to this foreign supplier verification program. It's going to be very important that your importation supply chain, unless you are the importer of record, is aware of these things and is beginning to gear up to figure out how they're going to handle it. There are a whole slew of new laws related to imported foods. I don't have the time to go over them, but I want to just share a couple of insights here. Use of third-party audits. This is going to be key. It's huge. It's massive. Question. If we go down this route, which we will, and a company says, well, I already have a GFSI audit. I'm FSQA or I'm BRC. Am I good? Am I all right? I don't know the answer to that. I suspect you're going to be close, but perhaps not quite where FDA wants you to be. I also believe that these programs will adjust really quickly, and that those audits will then actually count in the context of what's required for importation. I don't see how it can be any different. Simply, we cannot generate a whole new system. It's got to be figured out how you make the two work together. There'll be more impact of foreign governments. I've already mentioned that. I mentioned the requirement for certificates of certain foods. Not a lot of clarity on that yet. I want to call out the next bullet, the Voluntary Qualified Importer Program. This is the green lane. This is the fast channel. This is something we don't have a lot of detail on yet, but basically what FDA is saying is that certain importers who have a clean record and a good example of all the things I've talked about will be able to get into a fast track. There'll be a fee, but I suspect it'll be worth paying because it is going to minimize the likelihood your products will get stopped. And if they do get stopped, they will speed up the inspection, testing process so you get your answers much more quickly. So once again, if you're reliant on imported food, pay attention to the VQIP, Voluntary Qualified Importer Program, as it begins to emerge. Finally, I want to sort of turn to supply chain risk. Much of what we've talked about, preventive controls, et cetera, imports, is heavily focused on what's going on in your four walls. But in the context of the supply chain risk, I think this is huge. It's huge in terms of I'm back to my food safety quality protecting the brand deal. And if you're using brokers or your suppliers are using brokers, what do you know about that and that upstream supply chain? Anybody on your supply chain buy on the spot market? And if you do, what do you know about that product? Do you have comfort that it's being produced safely, or is it going to create a risk for you? You're relying on audits. Is it your own, or is it third party? How good are they? Well, they're done to great standards, but is the execution of that audit what you would like, as if your guys were in there? Do you rely on a certificate of analysis? Many people do. But what do you know about that COA? What do you know about the way that product was sampled? Was this just a 25-gram pull off the top of a 2,000-pound tote? Yeah, we tested it for salmonella negative, COA negative, we're good to go. Or was it a robust N60 sampling of that tote? Don't know. It's important. What was the test that was done? Was it an appropriate test? Was it an approved test? What lab did the test? Was it in-house? And if it was in-house, does the in-house know what it's doing? Was it a third-party lab? Do they know what they're doing? And so on. Do you test incoming ingredients? And if you do you use a risk-based approach? And how robust is that? All sorts of key questions around supply chain. Lots and lots of things to think about. In simple terms, supply chain risk, I believe you can break down to product risk and supplier risk. It's simplistic, and I think it works. I've got inherent risks with products, and I've got risks with suppliers, and they don't necessarily overlap. So as you begin to think through this, okay, what am I talking about? Product risks. Well, there's a risk on the geography. Am I getting product from an area of the world that's inherently high in heavy metals? Mercury, cadmium, lead, that could cause an inherent risk in the product. And then there's inherent risk from microbiological concerns. Products that are grown outdoors, grown in the dirt, possible of bird activity or wild animals. Does this product that I'm using have a history of problems, recalls, challenges, issues? What mitigations are being used in this product? Is it cooked? Is it treated in some way that reduces the risk I'm worried about, but perhaps not other risks? And am I using this product to create something that is going to be fed to a high-risk consumer? A child, the elderly, nursing homes, hospitals. Those are all really important things just around the product. With regard to the supplier, country, where's it from? What's their regulatory infrastructure? Have they been audited? What preventive controls do they have? GMPs? Have they had prior regulatory actions? Do they have a testing strategy? Is it any good? Is it robust? Have they thought about food defense? And what's their culture like? Lots and lots of things to think about. And the goal here is to assess this risk and apply numeric scores to the product and the supplier risk. And try to do this in a way that you are actually scoring them, putting numbers on them. And then look for the most risky situations. Look for those high-risk products linked to high-risk suppliers. That's like your red category. Red product, red supplier. Man, I need to pay attention to that particular situation. Then you've got to manage it through a combination of training, audits, either yours or robust third party, testing programs that you really understand and you know are effective to the extent that testing is never 100%, but it's part of an overall control strategy, and tracking so that if something goes wrong, you've got your arms around it quickly. And I'm a great believer in trending data. You may have specs for incoming product. Are you tracking that? Sure, it's always below spec, but is there an upward trend? They're getting closer from being really good to being not so good. Still in spec, still all good, but there's an upward trend. Okay, I need a signal. I need to know that this particular supplier looks like they're heading out of control. Obviously, what we're trying to do here is stay out of the ditch. And we're all struggling with staying out of the ditch. From a legal perspective, from a cost-effective perspective, there's just increasing challenges. And what's making this worse is not only are the challenges driving us, but the ditch is getting wider. The ditch is getting bigger. The problems are getting greater. The consequences are not just that you tip on your side, but you go crashing into brand disruption and destruction. So what's the ROI balance? How on earth do you figure all this out? Your goal is to protect your customer and protect your brand. And protecting the customer protects public health. And by doing so, you protect the brand. It's all about putting the resources, which are certainly finite. Nobody has infinite resources. Put it where the risk is, wherever that may be, internally, supply chain, whatever it is. Focus your resources there, but you need to know where to put them. Stay current. That risk changes. You can't do these assessments 1 year and think they'll be good for the next 12 to 18 months. They're not. Stuff changes. New foods emerge as high risk. Look for trends. Leverage new technology. We got a lot of stuff that we can use. Make life easier. You need to collect a lot of information. Figure out a way to sift that, sieve it, focus it, so you hear about or you discover the things that you really need to know about. And get ready for these new regulations. Don't wait. Staying in front. Again, emphasize resources where the risk. Current on global supply chain. Focus on prevention. It really is key. And be ready to react swiftly, because it doesn't matter how good you are, stuff goes wrong. And I want to leave you with a quote, which circles back to my notion that it's not all about compliance. And that is that while being in compliance is important to business continuity, I think robust preventive controls are important to business survival. And with that, I will hand it back to Barbara. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Acheson. What we're going to do now is, first, we're going to take us out of full screen. I am going to give you just a little bit of information about SafetyChain and SafetyChain for food. We'll take just a few minutes here. In the meantime, all of you should be able to now, on the lower right-hand side of your screen, see the Q&A box. You can enter your questions there and hit send, and we will get to all of your questions in just a few minutes. SafetyChain and our product SafetyChain software, which is our premier food solution, helps you manage many of the challenges that Dr. Acheson described in today's sessions. We help you save time, we help you save money, and we help you create efficiencies that can then lead to the ability to enforce regulatory, non-regulatory, and customer-driven compliance up and down your supply chain. We help you enforce safety and quality compliance standards and specifications, eliminate manual processes and errors, prevent withdrawals, recalls, and rejections, and ultimately, as Dr. Acheson mentioned, this leads to the protection of your market value and brand. This is a modular solution designed to help create those efficiencies and save time and money inbound, during production, and outbound. We provide real-time data collection from a global network of suppliers. We can have those test results analyzed in real time to specifications. We can generate COAs or send real-time alerts when something falls out of compliance. All records are time and date stamped to help with audit readiness. This helps provide visibility and transparency, again, upstream and downstream. And in the end, helps prevent non-compliant materials and ingredients from coming in and non-compliant finished goods from going out. And with that, we're going to go directly to the questions that we have. We're going to stay on as long as we can to get to everybody's questions. For those of you who might need to leave at the top of the hour, let me give you some information. I'll leave this slide here. You will be getting an email within 24 hours that will allow you to, in real time, download the recording and the slides. For more information on Levitt Partners, to stay current with their newsletter, you can text your email address to the number that you see there. For more information on Levitt Partners services, there's a URL there, and you can also email Dr. Acheson at david@levittpartners.com. For more information about SafetyChain for food, when you get the email that allows you to download the slides and the recording, that will also give you an opportunity to request things like pricing, a private demo, an ROI calculation, and more. And you can always find resources, white papers, upcoming webinars to sign up for on our website. And with that, let's go to some of the questions that we already have queued up here. Dr. Acheson, Mark is asking, under the inspection of records of the FSMA consumer complaints are subject to review, is this a reasonable record to review during the process, or is the permission granted specifically in the regs?
Good question, and I think what's being asked there is around FDA's ability to look at consumer complaints. That is specifically called out as a records access opportunity for FDA, and FDA has actually done that before. They have asked for those records, and there's certain conditions in the past that have often been invoked using the Bioterrorism Act, which has required companies to provide the consumer complaint records. partly because it can give the regulators insight as to whether something's been going on for a while longer than may appear at initial look. So they have the specific authority to do that. They have actually been doing it for a while. So I think in terms of the take-home from this is that one can expect that this will continue, that the FDA, when they want to inspect records, will add that to their list of things that they will ask you to provide, is the consumer complaint records.
Osiris is asking, with GS1 for Mexico, when do facilities have to obtain the registration? Is it till the end of October?
Okay. 2 points about registration. The first is that if you are a manufacturer, processor, wholesaler, distributor of FDA-regulated food today, and you are not registered, you should be registered by law. And that is a situation that's been in place since 2005. That's not new. So if you're not registered and you think you should be registered, you can register right now, and you should register right now, and the mechanism to do that is active right now. If you are everybody else who is falling into that manufacturing, processing, distributing, wholesaling group, and you are already registered, you will have to re-register. Even if you've already done it, you'll have to re-register. And the re-registration process was due to start October 1st, so like almost 3 weeks ago. It's been delayed, and I don't exactly know yet when it will be activated. I'm guessing it won't be that long, but once it is, I think many of those mechanisms that are on the screen will allow you to stay current, and if you are plugged into what FDA is doing or what we're sending out, you'll get to hear immediately when registration is open. So what this means is, to get to the question, is that once FDA opens that portal and say, okay, registrants, time to re-register, they will then have 3 months in which to re-register. So it goes way beyond the end of October. If it doesn't kick in until next week, it'll likely run through to sometime in January. So I think once the portal is open, it'll go 3 weeks. 3 months. Once the portal is open, it will go 3 full months.
Okay. And I'll remind everybody to put your questions in the Q&A. We'll try to get to those in chat. But what we're focusing on right now is the Q&A tab. John is asking, when do you speculate the Produce Traceability Initiative to be made law as standard for produce traceability?
I don't think the Produce Tracing Initiative will be made law anytime soon. The Produce Tracing Initiative was a response as a result of the tomatoes, hot pepper problems, 2008, because what was happening there was continued messaging about commodities. And a lot of that was driven by FDA's inability to track produce quickly. It was taking the FDA a long time, and I know because I was there struggling with this, weeks and weeks and weeks to track back. And the produce world said, yeah, this isn't good enough. We've got to improve our tracking, and that's where PTI, Produce Tracking Initiative, came from. This is an internal initiative within the produce industry. The FDA does not have the authority to require this full pedigree type product tracking, which is what this system is looking to do. They don't have the authority. That was not included in the Food Safety Modernization Act. There's a couple of things that were. Firstly, if you are handling high-risk foods, you're going to have to keep new records around that. The FDA has not yet put the rule out as to what those new records will look like. But so you'll have to keep more details around high-risk foods. And so what's a high-risk food? I think the FDA, again, hasn't specified what that is. But I think if you look at the list of everything that's been part of a recall or attention in the last 2 or 3 years, you'll have a pretty good idea of what the high-risk foods looks like. The FDA does not have the authority to take it more than one up, one back. That was in the Bioterrorism Act. That authority has not changed. And I do not anticipate that Congress will grant the FDA the authority to do something as extensive as the Product Tracking Initiative as a legal requirement. any time in the medium to even longer-term future. I think that's a long way off. So that's a long-winded answer to the question, but it kind of adds a little bit extra detail to it. The short answer is, when's this going to be law? Possibly never, but certainly not for quite some time.
Mm-hmm. Good, thank you. Shelley is saying that you mentioned earlier, if you pay attention to safety and quality, you'll likely be compliant at least 99% of the time, and not to let compliance be your driver. So she is asking then, how do you go into your C-suite to ask for funding for technology and other solutions when compliance isn't a part of the business case?
That's a really good question. Well, I would put it this way. If it takes compliance to drive your C-suite and not brand threat, then I hope they stay safe and they stay in their C-suite for the longevity. Because they won't. Because the board won't let them because they're not focusing on safety and quality, something bad will happen. And if you flip that around and you say, well, we were compliant with the law, but look what happened to our brand. It still got hit. That doesn't solve the problem. Now, I'm a realist. I totally get that in some situations the C-suite is only interested in being compliant with the law. I get that. And if that is the only hammer you have and the only way you can get your funding, go for it. Absolutely go for it. But if you recognize as a food quality professional, food safety professional, that what really matters is safety and quality, but it takes the compliance hammer to get the C-suite to pay attention, use it. By all means, use it. But I would urge the C-suite to look a little broader and think a little wider than simply being compliant. So maybe I'm speaking from my wishful thinking spectrum, but hey, that's what this is about. But you understand what I'm talking about. The fact that you're on this call illustrates that you understand what I'm talking about. But you've got to use every tool in the toolbox, and if you have to use the compliance tool to get what you need, go at it.
Great. Shelley, I'll also mention on our website there's a white paper called The ROI of Food Safety that might help you with that challenge as well. Excuse me, Barb, not me, is asking, if our headquarters are in Canada, producing no product but shipping samples occasionally, do they need to be registered with the FDA?
Oh, what a good question. And I've had that question before, and I've looked up the answer, and I'm not sure exactly what the correct answer is. I bet somebody on this call knows. What I would suggest, Barbara, is that we just capture exactly who it is and the contact information for that person, and let me follow up afterwards about the specific answer to that. It's complicated. And there's things in the Bioterrorism Act, and my memory doesn't serve me well, back to 2005, around those specifics. But there's definitely some wiggle room in that issue. And I don't want to give the wrong answer, so let me follow up subsequently with the person asking the question, if we could just make sure we have their contact information.
And Barb, we do have your contact information. You as well see David's email address, david@levittpartners.com. But we'll make sure that we get that to both of you. Matthew's saying, if I understand correctly, we expect rules to be published within the next few months for initial comments. Is this what is expected?
Yes, that's what I think. Keep in mind, everybody listening to this, is that this is one person's view of the world. This is me. I don't have a fast track. I don't have insight. I no longer work at FDA. I'm not connected directly to OMB or the White House, so this is just me looking at the landscape and thinking, knowing Washington, knowing the drivers, knowing what is important to certain people in certain factions, what do I think is going to happen? Yes, I think these rules will emerge, but you're right. They will emerge, they'll come out as proposed rules, and a proposed rule by definition is exactly that. Here's what we would like to do. And that's your opportunity to read these rules. I think our challenge is going to be, these rules are going to be big. I've not seen them, but rumor has it that each one of these rules, I talked about 4 of them, but each one of them is 700 to 800 pages long. So there's going to be an awful lot in them for us to digest. I'm kind of hoping they're not that long, but that's what I've heard. And but by definition, proposed rules is the time for public comment, and FDA has to respond to every comment. They can say, good idea, let's change the rule, here's what we've done. They can say, don't like that idea, here's why we think it's a bad idea, and they don't change the rule. And it still has to go back through OMB before it's finally approved. So this is definitely a window for anybody to pay attention, and everybody, but if they're 800 pages each and there's 4 of them come out in the space of a few weeks, it's going to be tough.
Okay, thank you. We have quite a few questions that we haven't gotten to yet. I do see that it's at the top of the hour. If you do need to leave us now, we'd like to thank you very much for attending. If you have questions that have been submitted that have not been responded to yet, if you're able to leave for your next meeting but not log out of WebEx, your question will stay there, and then you'll be able to hear your question and the answer to it in the recording. If not, then you can send your questions to SafetyChain.com. You can send them to info@SafetyChain.com, and we'll make sure that we get questions back to you. But if you can stay logged on while you go to your next meeting, your questions will stay up there. And so with that, thank you again. If you're leaving us, we hope to see you online at another Safety Chain Leadership webinar soon. And for everybody who's staying with us, we're just going to go right to the next question. Let's see. Gad is asking, will FSMA have the scope and breadth of GFSI initiatives, or will it be more limited in scope?
It'll be broader in scope than GFSI. It will certainly expect you to have covered everything that's in GFSI, and I think in certain cases it'll go beyond what's in GFSI. There's an awful lot in GFSI. I think the mechanism will be different. It won't be as prescriptive. When the preventive rules come out, remember that the FDA is writing preventive rules that have to cover everything that's under the manufacturing or processing umbrella for an FDA-regulated product. So these rules have to cover everything. It's then going to be followed up with a series of very targeted, specific guidance documents that also, I believe, will come out sometime during 2013. And these guidance documents are going to be really important to look at and read and understand. So I think that the rules will go further than GFSI. If you are GFSI certified, it's going to take you an awful long way towards where you need to be, but I think it's not going to take you quite as far as you're going to have to be. It's a good start.
Mm-hmm. Great. Maria is saying, if I understand, the FDA can review my records, but is it within their authority to copy any of those records?
Oh, yeah. Yes, it is. The FDA can and usually do expect copies of the records, and anybody who's had a visit from FDA under this guise of show me your records basically means give me a copy of your records. Mm-hmm. So you can expect that they will take them with them. Great.
Let's see. Is it your opinion, Beth is asking, do you think pet food will be considered a high-risk food type?
That's a great question. I think yes. Bearing in mind that most of the concern with pet food has been linked to the connection with human illness, not pet illness. That I think it's highly likely that'll be considered a high-risk food. So be ready for it. If it's not, then the pet food industry's, I think, squeaked away. But I would just assume that was what's going to happen. If you think about what it is that the criteria are that the FDA have talked about as to what constitutes a high-risk food, it's foods that have been recalled, subject to repeated recalls, or linked to illness, and pet foods fall right into that.
Okay. Alan is saying that you mentioned N60 sampling. For small and very small businesses, the mention of N60 produces a very negative response. He's saying, right. And N15, Do you think that those less robust sampling would be acceptable for the smaller companies?
I totally understand that concern and we're back to the return on investment, and we're back to using dollars effectively. I think the most important question to ask yourself in relation to that is, whatever sampling strategy you're using, what assurance does it give you that the sample is a true positive or a true negative? That's a better way to look at this. N60 isn't 100% guaranteed to find a problem. It's just better than, at least it's an optimized number that was worked out by a series of eminent food scientists a while ago. It's not perfect. You go to N120, you up the odds a little bit, but you also up the cost and the challenges. You go down to an N30, it goes the other way. You go to an N of 1, it goes even further back. So I think the more important question is not to say N60 is magic, but to say, here's my sampling plan. What is that telling me in terms of the reliability of the result? Do I feel 95% comfortable that this negative is a real negative, or am I sort of just sleeping well at night because I've got a piece of paper that says it's negative, but in truth, I may as well be flipping a coin? That's the question to ask, rather than just being heavily focused on N60. I simply use that as an example of what's typically considered to be a robust, statistically appropriate sampling strategy, but I completely recognize that it's not necessarily doable for everybody. So maybe what you do is there are some things you don't test because you've done the risk analysis and said, man, the likelihood of this being positive is really, 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 really small. And then there are other things that you should test which are much, much higher risk, so you do N60s on them. And then there's maybe some in the middle where there's some gray zone. But it's not one size fits all. It's not like no testing. It's not like N60 on everything. It means what I'm suggesting is that you look carefully at everything that you're testing and make a case-by-case determination. And I realize that that's a little bit of a heavier lift, but it's much more justifiable with the regulators come in and say, let's see your testing program and let me have you defend why you're doing what you're doing. Well, FDA, here's why we came up with an N30, N60, N120, N5, whatever it is. And here's the rationale, here's the explanation, and they'll say, okay, yeah, no, that makes sense. There's some logic, there's some science behind this, good, and they're happy. So it's a bit more of a complicated answer than just saying it's N60 or nothing.
Sure. Irene is saying, first of all, thank you for a great seminar, and saying, will food recall plans be required under FSMA? Who will be conducting foreign supplier inspection programs, the FDA or third parties?
Food recall plans, I believe, will be required as part of your food safety plan, yes. I'm pretty sure that's going to have to be in there. Another one, I haven't seen the rules yet, but I believe that you should have that. And frankly, you should have it anyway. I'm back to my safety and quality argument. Irrespective of whether it's part of being compliant with the law, if you're making a food product or in any way connected with a food product, you should have a plan that speaks to that. Second part of the question is the foreign inspections, right, Barbara? Is that what it was? Is like who's going to be doing them?
Mm-hmm. FDA or third party?
It will be a combination. It'll be a combination of three components. FDA will do some, and FDA has already ramped up its number of foreign inspections. They typically did 100 a year, and it's been like that for a very long time. They're now up to about 1,000 a year, 1,200 a year. They're slated, according to FSMA, to double that every year for the next 4 or 5 years. They're simply not going to do it because they don't have the resources to do it. So some of it will be FDA inspection. Some of it will be foreign government. The FDA is not there yet, but we will see the FDA taking a foreign government inspection as being comparable to an FDA inspection. They're working out the process to do that. And some of it will be third party. And that third-party inspection information will be used for the voluntary qualified importer program that I mentioned and the foreign supply verification program. So it is a combination of all three, and it will vary by country and by product and likely by what's a hot topic at any particular time as to how much FDA does versus how much they rely on foreign governments or third parties. we can expect these programs to begin to take shape, I think, in 2013, 2014. We're going to have a much better idea of what this foreign government involvement and third-party certification process will look like. So I think, Barbara, we've got future webinars on this topic down the road because there's going to be a lot more coming out next year.
Yep, I agree. Cindy is asking, when tracking one up, one back, how long does the FDA expect companies to be able to do this? Is it hours? Is it days?
24 hours.
24 hours.
24 hours is what the FDA expects you to be able to produce the records, one up, one back. Again, not part of FSMA, not part of new laws, part of 2002 Bioterrorism Act that came into effect in 2005 is the one up, one back. Doesn't matter how you do it. You can have the data in a shoebox if you want. You do not have to have it electronic. You do not have to have it in any format. You just have to be able to provide it to FDA. That is what the law says today. As I mentioned earlier, if you are making a high-risk food, that is going to change. Some of the details on exactly what you have to keep and how you have to keep it will change. But the one up, one back part will not change. The agency, FDA, does not have the authority to make it two up, two back, or anything like that. But I digress slightly. Right now, 24 hours is the answer to the question.
Okay, great. Mark is asking, was the expansion of Sunland processed peanut products to whole peanuts products at another facility a result of a company voluntary action, or was it forced by the FDA under FSMA or another regulatory action?
I believe it was a voluntary action by the company. I've not seen anything to suggest that it was anything other than a voluntary action. So I don't think FDA invoked their mandatory recall authority on this. I'm sure if they had, we would have seen something about that, and I have seen nothing. So I think it's entirely voluntary. But if anybody who's listening to this, who's been in a recall situation, will know that there's voluntary and there's voluntary. And in truth, you have little choice when it really comes down to it, because in essence, the FDA, if you refuse today, they've got the capacity to make you do it. They've got the law to make you do it. But the negative press and the negative brand impact that is accompanied by the press release that says Company X is being mandated to do a recall because they have refused to withdraw a product that we, FDA, believes is making people sick, is not going to do your stock price any good whatsoever. So that is why mandatory recall will be a very rare tool when companies who are in this situation that realize that there is no choice. And voluntary is definitely a better way to go from every perspective. And I use voluntary in quotes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Christine is saying, my company imports palm-based fatty acids and glycerins that are food grade, so they would be added to food formulations, but they're not considered foods. How does FSMA affect my company regarding these products? All of my suppliers are registered.
Good. I think I'd want to just sort of have a bit more detail about, is she sure that these are not considered foods? They sound a little bit like foods to me, or that they would be under some component of Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act regulation. So I think it would depend a little bit on exactly what those products are. But any food additive, flavoring, dietary supplements even, are all under FSMA. We haven't talked about dietary supplements at all, but they are all under FSMA as well. All of these things we've talked about apply to the dietary supplement world. The only thing in FSMA that doesn't is the preventive control requirement, because dietary supplement companies are already under a GMP requirement that predates FSMA. So if it's truly not a food, then FSMA won't apply. But I think that would be the question I'd want to check, is just exactly where it's falling.
Mm-hmm. How do you see mobile application technologies playing a role in FSMA compliance?
Oh, what a great question. I see every kind of technology playing a role in FSMA compliance. we're at a point where the requirement to collect, analyze, and respond to information is just getting increasingly quick, fast. The need to be super responsive is just accelerating for both the brand protection part as well as the compliance part. I think mobile apps is a part of that. It's just part of current technology. Absolutely no reason why one shouldn't use it in the right systems, and I think it will be used. I think food companies will look for every opportunity to make this as painless and quick and as efficient and easy and as inexpensive as they can. If mobile apps is part of that solution, it'll take off.
We still have quite a few questions. We are at a quarter after the hour. I think what we need to do now is we'll take one more. We do have all of these questions down in the WebEx system, and we'll go through. And for those of you who we've not gotten to your question, we will make sure that you get an answer. Some of them are directed to us here at SafetyChain. I'll get answers to you, and then I will put the rest of the questions together and send them to you, Dr. Acheson, if that's okay. We will make sure that we get answers to everybody. But I think we need to wrap up now, and we'll end with an interesting question from Dundee, who's saying, many consumer complaints might focus on the quality of a product, but not necessarily be a direct link to a safety concern. Mm-hmm. Is a quality complaint enough to trigger a federal inquiry to supply chain programs and records?
I know I don't believe it will be. Remember that for the FDA to access the records in the first place, there's got to be a reasonable belief that there's a problem. So, as I sort of suggested, somewhat flippantly, that reasonable belief can be a pretty low bar. It's still a bar. It's still got to be there that the food in question has caused a serious adverse health consequence, class 1 type situation. If as part of that, the FDA says, submit all your consumer complaints, and they look at them, and they're all quality, that isn't going to drive the FDA to go and expand on the records access or require other information. No way. And if they, frankly, if the FDA are using it for that, I would push back. I would. I think that's not the intent of the law. It's not what the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act is about, and it's inappropriate. So I would absolutely urge you to give the FDA what they ask for because that's the best approach. But if they then, quote, misinterpret that information, or you think they're taking quality data and using it to extract records from other parts of your facilities, and that's their only driver, push back. You should. I'm certainly not suggesting that companies roll over and play dead. I think it's just being realistic as to what the law now allows the FDA to do, which is a whole lot more than it used to. So that's another good question. We've had some great stuff.
Yeah, it's great. And I'm just seeing that there are still quite a few questions in the chat, so we will definitely make sure that we get answers to all of you. We can tell which ones we've gotten to and which ones we haven't. So with that, thank you all so much for this great interactive session and all of your questions. And as I said, if we did not get to your question, we will get you answers in a timely manner. And very especially to you, to Dr. David Acheson, this has been a fabulous webinar, very informative. I'm getting great comments saying, when is he coming back? So we'll look to future webinars. And thank you so much. We know you're very busy. Thank you for sharing your insight with us today.
Thank you, and thank you to all those who stuck with us through. And it was great fun. And thank you for all the wonderful questions.